I'm Teresa, welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me here today. Today I'm inspired by a video by James Luke Burke, linked in the description below. So not my original idea, although I've taken it in my own direction. I've used the simple study that he used in his video, and I've decided to explore how I can create using different media that I own. This is basically a playtime for me. I've used gouache, I've used acrylic, I've used watercolor, I've used pastel, and I've used colour pencils, and I have just created 5 fun studies of Mike and Sully from Monsters Inc. in a really simplified form, just to get familiar with these products, just so that I can share my views with you and on how they work and what the pros and cons are and what my personal feelings are. And hopefully it'll encourage you to get out some different media, take a simple idea and just play using the different medias. Take the time to play and find out and explore how different items work. I'm going to move these out of the way. I'll get set up with the products that I'm going to use today, and I'll be right back. So today's video, as you can see, is going to be a little bit different to some of the ones that I've done recently. I'm not going to be printing today. I fancied a complete change. Every so often, I think it's nice just to do something different and get out of any sort of creative rut that you might be feeling. And I was inspired to do what I'm going to do today by watching a YouTube live video by James Luke Burke. I do follow him on Instagram and on YouTube, and for any of you that have seen any of my journal flips, I've taken a lot of his online courses as well. I enjoy his teaching style. I like the subject matter that he uses, and I was really inspired by this painting that he's done of Mike and Sully from Monsters Inc. It was based on a piece of concept art. It's a nice, simple, bold graphic design. And I kind of wanted to experiment with doing this simple image, which was quite quick and easy to create, and have a go at replicating it in different ways with different media, just to play around and get a feel for different paints and things that I haven't maybe used for a while. I do think it's important to experiment and find out what you enjoy using, what the limitations of certain media are, how you can mix things together. It's really important to take that time sometimes to just experiment. And it was something, again, going back to James Luke Burke and his online courses, his Virtual Voyage 1 course, which I've recently completed. Actually, it was posted online last year. I've made a start, I've put it down, and I've come back and completed it. There was an exercise based on The Wizard of Oz, where we took an image. This is a painting of Dorothy, and each quarter is done in a different media. So I've used watercolor, pastels, color pencils, and gouache, and it was a sort of an experiment to stretch yourself to use different media and see the different effects and get confident in the way that they work. So I really enjoyed using different media to create this, and I thought it would be fun to take this quite simple image of Mike and Sully and rework it in different media. And that's really what I'm going to be doing today, and just chatting through my process and the sort of properties of each of the media that I'm using. And I hope that then those of you watching will find that maybe interesting and pick up a few tips and techniques and maybe be inspired to try different products that you haven't tried before. So I'm going to be doing all of my studies using this pad here. This is a paint on pad by Claire Fontaine. Nice brand for paper. This pad has different papers in it. So it's got some black, it's got tan, it has a grey, it's got a textured white, this denim blue, and a smooth white. It's good for all media, wet or dry. So I'm going to be using various sheets from this today with my various media that I've got, and I'm going to begin with one of my most sort of scary things, the things that I need a little bit more confidence with, which is gouache. It's the media that James used in his original painting on his YouTube live video, and I will link all these in the description below if you want to go and take a look yourself. But I'm going to have a go with gouache. I've got some Arteza gouache here. Picked out a few colours that I think are going to be what I need. And I'm just sort of going to get on. I'll get some of these on my palette and zoom in a little bit, and I'll talk you through the process. So I've put some paint in my palette. I've chosen lime green, cerulean blue, lilac, rose, and I've got titanium white and noir, which is black. As I say, the gouache I'm using are these Arteza gouache, come in a set of 60 colours that I've got. I think they do a smaller set as well. But the thing with gouache, and the thing that I find very tricky, is getting the consistency right. You need to use them fairly thickly because they're quite opaque and they are layerable. If you get them too thin, then you're not going to get the opacity, but if they're too thick, they are quite difficult to work with. They are water-based, like a watercolour paint, so you do have to be careful when layering not to reactivate anything underneath, and sort of not to overwork it. So it is quite a lesson in putting the paint down and sort of trying to get it right as early on as you possibly can. And I think that's what frightens me with gouache. It's a tricky thing to master, but I do love the flat finish that you get with it. It's a nice sort of matte, even flat finish, and it is a favourite of sort of illustrators. There's something about the medium that I think appeals to people. So I am going to do my absolute best to do well with my gouache today, but we will see how it goes. It's a learning curve, as always. Anyone who's interested, the paintbrushes that I'm using are silver black velvet. They are not cheap brushes. They are, they're a quality brush, and I do use these for gouache and for when I'm using watercolor. They're a mix of a squirrel and synthetic, and I find them really worth absolutely every penny that I've paid for them. They're really, with watercolor especially, you want something that's going to hold a lot of water but keep a nice point and have some flexibility, and they seem to tick all the boxes for me. So I'm just going to dry this layer before I carry on. I'm going to add a little water to my lime green. Just to make it a little bit more movable. And we're going to paint Mike in, who's just basically a big circle. As you can see, if you start to overwork it, this is the thing that I find tricky with gouache, is that I do get some movement of that black underneath. But I think by drying it and adding a little bit more, we should be able to get a little bit more opacity there. I'm going to leave him like that. I don't want to overwork him too much. This is supposed to be a simple painting. So next I'm going to move on to Sully. I'm going to use this cerulean blue, but I'm going to add in a little bit of white just to lighten the colour a touch. I'm going to draw him in as a nice sort of big basic blocky rectangle. Now Sully has a few markings on him, so I'm going to mix up a little bit of lilac with some white. Add in a touch of the rose. Give that a dry. Now Mike's defining feature is his giant eyeball. I'm going to give Sully 2 eyes as well. And finally, we're going to just add in a few little details. So we've got to give Mike his, Sully his horns. And we'll give him his mouth, a couple of teeth, a couple of horns for Mike, and a smiley mouth. Also going to pop him a couple of legs on, and we'll just sketch in Sully's arm there. And I think we can call that gouache study complete. As you can see, there is good opacity, you can layer. I find it really tricky not to sort of reactivate, so try not to worry about it too much. Getting the consistency right can be a little tricky, but it's persevering, and actually I love the effect. I think it's really, really nice, just for creating some sort of bold graphic images. Next up, I'm going to have a go with some acrylic paint. Again, I've got some Arteza acrylic colours. This was a set of 60. The colours are pretty much the same. I've got violet, rose, Mars black, titanium white, cerulean blue. They don't do a lime green, but I've got yellow green and lemon yellow, and I'm going to probably mix a little bit of those together just to create the colour that I want for Mike. Basically, acrylic colours, they are still water soluble. You can mix them with water, you can wash your brush with water, but once they dry, they plasticize, they become permanent, they don't reactivate if you layer on top. I will say that with the last one where I painted the background black and then layered over with the gouache, I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to paint around with my black, simply because the lemon yellow and the yellow green and the violet and the rose are a semi-opaque, semi-transparent colour. These paints do have the opacity on them, and I'm concerned that I won't be able to get any coverage, so I'm going to paint the characters and then I'm going to paint in the blacks around afterwards. That's the only difference. If my colours were all classed as fully opaque, I may consider layering over a dark background. I'm going to be using a different paintbrushes this time. I'm using just a synthetic Taklon bristle for acrylic paint. But other than that, I'm going to work in a very similar way. I'm going to mix up my green and yellow together. And again, keep this image nice and simple. I do like using acrylic paints. I like using them for the fact that they are permanent and they make a great base for then going over with other media. You could then put water soluble media over the top and you don't have to worry about these reactivating once they get wet. You can use markers and pencils. You can use acrylic paint pens, pastels, lots of different things over the top. But they are a really useful paint. And, you know, good coverage, good colour, vibrancy. And they are readily available from lots of places. They're not expensive, they're easy to get hold of. You'll find that paints in tubes like these tend to be a slightly thicker consistency, and paints that come in pots, which tend to be aimed more at the crafting market rather than the painting market. They tend to be a little bit more fluid, but they should all have good coverage. So next up I'm going to mix my blue colour. Add in a little bit of white. The other thing to watch with acrylics, whereas the gouache all dry to a nice flat matte finish, some acrylics dry to a matte finish, some have a slight sheen. It can be to do with the binder that's in the colour, holding the pigment together. So be aware that that can, not only from brand to brand, but within a brand, that can be a difference from colour to colour. But again, easy to get a nice, good coverage, nice vibrant colours. And as long as you wash your brushes out before the paint is dried on them, easy to just wash away with water. Let's just add a few details to Sully again. It's time to do the details now. And here's our study in acrylic. And as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see, there is a slight sheen to that, but still good vibrant colours, in a very similar way to the gouache, but the gouache is completely flat matte in its finish. But both of them really fun, really good for sort of simple, bold artworks like this. Next up, I'm going to have a go using watercolour. While I've still got paintbrushes, I've switched back to my silver black velvet brushes because I'm using a watercolour. The watercolours I've got here is a little custom palette that I've made. Some of them are Daniel Smith watercolours, and most of the ones I'll be using for this study are going to be Daniel Smith watercolours. The others are handmade watercolours, and I buy them from Julia K's Studios on Etsy. Again, I'll link in the description below. You can use any watercolour paints that you like. I do have sets of student quality, but I've kind of graduated to handmade paints. I like the fact that you can get nice glittery ones, metallic ones, interesting different colours, granulating colours that sort of split and move on the paper. And you get what you pay for, basically. And if you enjoy watercolour, You know, start off basic. If you enjoy it, sort of progress, try a few more slightly specialist paints, and you'll be amazed at the effects that are actually out there that you can create. Now, the thing to remember with watercolour is it is transparent. Obviously it is water-based and therefore will react every time it gets wet. But the colours are transparent. So again, if you put a dark colour down, if you put a light colour on top, that dark colour is still going to show through. It's going to affect the colours that you place on top of it. I also find that, especially if you work in quite wet washes, let the paint do what it wants. It wants to move, it wants to blend it, and you know, try not to restrict it too much. Otherwise you could get disappointed. But I am going to sort of try and create a fun, loose watercolour study this time. I'm using the textured white paper that was in this pad. I do like using a textured watercolour paper. And for this, I do have this sort of limey green. This is a Daniel Smith watercolour. I don't remember the name of it. If I can find the tube that it came in, I will pop a little caption up on the screen. This turquoisey colour, again, I know is a Daniel Smith colour. And this bright pink, I believe this is actually opera pink. I've dried the turquoise a little bit, but just left a slight dampness just so I can have a bit of movement there with the colours working together. Now I'm going to add some water to the paper around the outside. Going up close but trying not to actually touch the paint. Now I can drop some colour into that water. This is one of Julia's handmade paints, and this one is called Hell. A lot of hers are named, she lives in Sweden, so a lot of her paints are named after Norse, Scandinavian mythology, gods, goddesses, places, etc., as well as just generally Scandinavian names. But I like this. It's a very dark sort of indigo that if you apply it quite thickly, it can almost look like a black. But it granulates really nice and sort of splits into a grey and a blue. So I thought that would make a nice background. I'm just going to see if I can soften that edge a little. Now watercolour, as I say, is transparent. However, some paints will have some body colour in them. I do have this white here, again one of Julia's paints. This is from her Pretty Potions collection and is called Scaligro. She did a set of paints named after Harry Potter potions. And although not completely opaque, it has enough body colour in it that you can layer it over the top. Again, try not to overwork it because you'll reactivate that colour that's underneath. And as it dries, it will probably pull up some of the colour simply because it is it's activating that colour underneath with water. Now I want to add the finer details, which I'm not going to be able to do that using the white watercolour. So I'm going to have a go with this Watercolor white chalk oil pencil. It's supposed to have quite a good colour opacity. I don't know whether it does or not. I might switch to something like a paint pen or a gel pen. But I'm just going to give it a quick go to see whether it is going to show up. Now I'm not happy with how white that is, so I will go to my plan B, which is to use either a paint pen or a gel pen. And here's our watercolour study. Very different to the other two, much lighter in tone, more texture because of the paints that I've used, but quite freeing, and you know, nice to see the contrast between something like that acrylic one with the watercolour, something that it creates a totally different mood. So I've put away the paints now, put away my water and my palette, and I'm going to have a go with some dry media, and I'm going to use pastel. Now again, pastel is something I don't have a great deal of confidence with. I wanted to get better with it. Pastel smudges, it can be tricky to work with, to layer, keep it clean. And in the past I've always used the sticks of soft pastel, but since switching to these Faber-Castell Pitt pastel pencils, I found it a lot easier to manage. One, because I'm more familiar with holding a pencil. You can get a much finer point. It's easier to work in detail and small areas rather than with the sticks of pastel. And I don't know, there's something, the pencil just feels more familiar in my hand, and so I seem to get better results. So I've chosen colours that I want. I'm not going to read, I mean, they come with numbers on, they don't have colour names, but I've chosen obviously a couple of limey greens, a couple of turquoise, a pink purple, I've got a black and a white, and I've got like a very dark brown. I'm going to work on this tan coloured paper just as I can use a coloured background. So that is the nice thing about pastels, is you can work on a toned paper, which is really nice because the colours are opaque, and so it's a good way of being able to add highlights and things. If you start with a mid-toned paper, you can go lighter and darker as well. So I'm going to basically sketch out my circle for Mike. I also like the fact this paper has a slight tooth to it, which is what you need really with pastel. I'm going to apply some of this darker green. Then I'm going to apply some of this lighter, more lime green. Then I'm going to take one of these paper blending stumps and blend the colours together to soften the effect. So I'm going to work slightly differently to previously. So I'm going to put in the eye. So next in I'm going to block in Sully. Let's add a little bit of detail to Sully. I'm going to add a little shading around the outside of these figures and blend it out. So there's the basis of the design. I'm just going to add a little bit more definition. And there's our finished pastel sketch. I really like this nice sort of soft vintage feel to the image, very much like a children's illustration in a book, in an old book. Again, totally different feel to our watercolor, to our gouache, to our acrylic. Much softer, and able to create lots of nice interesting texture in there using the pencil. And finally, I'm going to use colour pencils. Now these are Faber-Castell Polychromos colour pencils. I like them. They seem to have a good mix of softness and hardness, so you can lay down lots of good colour, layer lots of different colours on top of each other, but they hold a point quite well. They're not too soft. I have tried Prismacolor pencils in the past and I find them just a little bit too soft for me. They blunt too easily and I find it frustrating to keep sharpening them. They tend to have a habit of breaking if you're not careful, but these have a really good sort of balance of being soft enough to lay down a lot of colour but firm enough to keep a point. I also use a Derwent blending pencil quite often when I'm using colour pencils. This is just like a soft, it's a colourless, almost wax core, and it does help blend colours together. You could still use your little paper blending stump as well, but I do like to use the pencil. That's something that I've got in the habit of using. Now with pencils, you can layer colours on top of each other, but you can't layer a light colour particularly on top of a dark colour. I wouldn't be able to put the white eyeball in on top of the green circle that is Mike. So I'm going to be sort of leaving areas white if I want them to be white. But again, we want to keep this fairly simple. We're not looking for complicated technical drawings here. It's all about just creating simple studies to get the feel of different media. So this is the smoother of the white papers in this pad. It's not perfectly smooth. It's not like a Bristol board. There is a bit of a tooth in it, which means it should work well with these pencils. But I thought that the one with the texture was a little bit too textured for my liking. So I was going to stick with this smoother one. Now I could use a pencil to sketch in an outline, but I haven't felt the need to do that yet. So I'm just going to go straight in with my colour pencil. And I've a good tip, hold the pencil towards the back end if you want to keep it nice and loose. If you hold down near the point here, you tend to go more detailed. I'm happy to keep this sketchy, so I'm holding my pencil towards the back end of the pencil. So I've sketched in a loose outline, sketched in where I want that eye to be. And I'm going to apply a light layer of colour. It's easier to add more. If you put too much down, you can struggle. So go for light layers and gradually build the depth up. going to sketch the details of the horns, the arms, the legs in with black this time rather than white, because I have a white background. But I'm still going to keep them simple. And I'm going to leave the background white, but just frame the area of the study, just to sort of ground the image on the page. And I really like that. It's a very sort of cute interpretation of the characters. But again, so different from everything else, so different from our pastel, from our acrylic, our gouache, and our watercolor. So I'm just going to clear all my products away now, and I'll just come back for a final recap of the images that I've created today and my thoughts on what I've enjoyed using and the pros and cons of each one. So just to recap, here are our 5 studies. We began with the gouache, which I really enjoy using, albeit I'm no expert and I do struggle and I have issues, but there's something about it I do like. I love the completely flat finish of it, and the fact that, you know, you can layer the colours, and with a bit of practice I will get even better at layering the colours. But I love this image. It's cute, it's fun, it's bright, it's got character. So then we moved on to acrylic, which gives very similar results, but the difference between acrylic and gouache is acrylic is completely permanent. Once dry, I can go over that with some wet media and it will not reactivate, whereas the gouache would. Again, bright and colourful. You get some sort of variation in finish. The blue is quite a flat colour here. The black has a little bit of a sheen to it. That is a common thing with acrylics, but again, easy to use, easy to get some bright and crisp results. Next up was watercolour, totally different kettle of fish watercolour. And although this not the best finished sort of study here, I don't know, it's not overly happy with the background, but I do love using watercolour, and there's just something about it that, you know, it goes its own way, it does its own thing, and I love that with it. So again, it just creates a fun, loose study here. And again, we just added in those little bit of detail with a white paint pan. Then we had pastel pencils, great for using on toned paper like this. Created a really sort of cute vintagey feel. I really like that. Nice soft blend. There's something about it that's just, I want to work more with pastels. I want to get better with pastels. And the pencils are the way forward for me. I get good control with the pastel pencil. And then finally, our coloured pencils. This one I didn't put a coloured background. I left the background white. And I just love it. It's super soft. It's got character. I've added a little bit of shading but kept the design simple. Really, really happy with the effect. And the polychromos pencils for me give the best sort of compromise between hardness and softness, and I just love that. Really, really nice, very illustrative qualities, and just a great pleasure to use and to work with. So our 5 images, all slightly different, all have their pros, all have their cons, but just by taking a very simple study, so you're not worried about great detail here, it gives you the time to focus on the products that you're using. And that was the exercise of what I wanted to do today. I didn't want to create a finished piece. I didn't want to do a fancy journal page. I wanted to get out my products and explore the differences in how they work, so that I can sort of store that information for future. When I'm coming to do other things, I might think, do you know what, this is best suited using gouache, or this is best suited using pastel. You know, it's this time to play that we need. It's important. Sometimes if you're limited with time, all you want to do is sit down and create a finished piece, but don't underestimate the importance of this sort of playtime to just get familiar with the way your products work, and whether indeed you like them or you don't like them. You know, it's sometimes we buy something, we have a go, we're not sure. Make the time to give it a good workout and try it. And if you indeed don't like it, well then sell it, pass it on to somebody else who can use it. Use that money to buy something else that you're going to enjoy working with. Just because your favourite artist likes working in one media doesn't mean to say that you're going to like it. But this was all inspired by a simple YouTube live by James Luke Burke. I'll pop the links down below, as I said earlier. I'll pop the links below to any of the products that I've used if I can find a link. But as always, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you again soon. Bye.